These swimmers would hang out in that space, they'd have their noodles, and most of the time they would be floating on their noodles and talking to each other. And every now and then one of them would go off and swim a lap, and then they'd come back, and then they'd talk a little bit more, and it was this, and they probably, who knows, went out for breakfast afterwards or something. So that was this little community of swimmers. There was another group of swimmers who were lean and mean, you know, no body fat, you know, had the high-tech bathing suit, high-tech goggles. There was, at the desk at the pool, there were charts that they could record their times. They could be they were very, very intense about their swimming. They'd get in the pool. They wouldn't look at anybody else. They'd do their laps, you know, like this, you know, back and forth, and they'd be done. There was another group who were more contemplative and who took their time, weren't paying attention to the laps, weren't counting how many laps they were doing, you know, would swim until they were done. And then there were, so those are three kinds of very, very different swimmers. And then there were, well, and then there's probably a subset of different. Then there were ones who were really doing it for the physical exercise, that this was something really important. I knew it's good cardio, it's a lifelong practice, it's something really important for me to do, it's right, it's part of my daily routine, this is the right thing to do, it's good for my mind and body. So those four types of swimmers, in some ways, could be understood as analogous to four very different types of learners, people who we encounter in our world. So the coffee klatch people are mostly there for the social experience, or a lot of it is for the social experience. I mean, they could just go out to breakfast, but so they are trying to get something out of the experience of being in the pool. But they're there really to be with their friends, to enjoy this time together. Who are the ones who are recording their times and and being very focused and driven? What kind of learners are they? I would call them goal-oriented learners. They're really there to build a skill, to develop expertise, to get ahead. What about the contemplative ones, the ones who were there for the sheer enjoyment? Those I would call the seekers, or the ones who are the spiritual, or the seekers, the ones who are there and engaged in a sort of, this process is going to help me in the next steps of my day. This is going to move me forward in a better, healthier, more whole way. And the fourth group, the ones who are there because it's good for the body and it's what I do, are the ones who are the lishma. They've embedded it in a practice. This is how I define myself. This is my identity. So those four kinds of learners we can think about in the context of who are populating our adult learning worlds. I think one of the things that I'm taking away from this day is that we need to come up with a new name. That adult Jewish learning is not broad enough, rich enough, doesn't have the breadth and depth for really describing what it is we need to be doing as rabbis and educators working with Jews and people who are fellow travelers.
Like when colleges have alum, like Columbia is doing a huge outreach now for retiree, the people in the community who want to continue learning. They don't call it adult ed.
Right.
What do they call it?
I don't know. That's what I'm thinking. But adult ed sounds like per se boring.
Continuing education.
At UCLA, it's called the Plato Society.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we really have to break away. I mean, in the reform movement, it's been called lifelong learning. But even that, I mean, learning. A number of people have talked about their glossy brochures that get left behind or get tossed in the recycling even before the seal is cracked. That there's something about adult Jewish learning or adult learning that really has a chilling effect on the great majority of Jews in the pews, not to mention those who aren't showing up.
Can I just ask the question? I don't know if we have defined adult.
When do you consider adult Jewish learning starting? Because you're using a lot of characteristics in your description that are, I think, farther along adults, right? It's not a, what do we call now people?
Emerging adults.
Not emerging adults.
No, I think
what
that
is
this,
your definition?
well, I think adulthood is not, you know, adulthood is a state of mind. It's a, I mean, it is a physical maturation, but, I mean, think about yourself. I mean, and this is a question I ask my students, you know, what makes an adult? And some say financial independence from their parents. Some say having children. Some say graduating college. You know, that there are different milestones and markers where, and adulthood is acquired over time. It's not something one day you wake up, like your bar mitzvah, today I am a man. You know, it doesn't happen that way. So I think we're talking really about, I mean, we could consider, yeah, I mean, if you want to create a cutoff, post-high school or post-college is the world we're talking about here. There was a study done, it's now 12 years old, it's as far as I know, the only national study of adult Jewish learning that Stephen Cohen and R.A. Davidson did about a dozen years ago. And I think we would ask very different questions today on that survey than what were asked even a decade ago. But one of the key findings that I keep coming back to from that study was that of the people interested in any kind of adult study, about 16% were interested in text study. 16%. And yet when we think about the conventional, traditional offerings of what is out there, 85% of it is text study. So that was a trigger that led Diane and I to do some further research into what's out there and what does this landscape look like. And that was what resulted in this chapter that just came out in the International Handbook of Jewish Education. So in your folders is a flyer that looks like, a handout that looks like this.
You think when they said text study,
They said Bible or Talmud.
Okay, right.
Bible or
That's
Talmud.
important.
If you added Jewish history, you might get past 20%, maybe up to 25%. Holocaust and cooking, very popular. Holocaust and cooking were the two most popular. Jewish cooking and the Holocaust. And Israel slightly below that.
That in
And
itself,
at that time, mysticism and Kabbalah, not at all. Whether that was
Kabbalah. Maybe Kabbalah.
Kabbalah.
Okay, so what we did, and so there was the Cohen and Davidson research from 2000, and then Diane and I were involved in a longitudinal study of Jewish learning on Long Island from 2004 until 2009, 5 years. So we took our research and the Cohen research and our research from the Mountain School, and that created our base of data, and then we went out and interviewed 10 opinion leaders in the world, 10 high-level practitioners of adult Jewish learning, to really find out what was going on in their world today, as opposed to 10, 20 years ago. The decade of the 90s was the renaissance of adult Jewish learning. It was, everything was exploding. Melton and Mayo was everywhere. There was all of this excitement. Every community was having their own days of learning and so on. And then we noticed a dip. And what was the cause of that? And what these practitioners said, for the most part, was that when they started, their orientation was for the Lishma learner, was about enrichment, was about literacy, was about building, trying to embed the value of lifelong learning, that was core. Where they stood at the end of the first decade of 2000 was adult learning has to be paired with something else. Learning in and of itself will attract that 16%, or learning as we define it will attract that 16%. But what we really need to think about is how can learning be built in partnership with other core needs, with the pastoral needs, with community development needs, with outreach needs, with needs about big questions that people have, questions of meaning. And more they were beginning to target and rethink about their learning offerings in ways that would meet people where they are, would try to think about those various swimmers in the pool and really take their questions, take their concerns, take what they're looking for, or maybe they don't even know how to ask what they're looking for, but try to bring that out with them. So we took all of that, and we began to see a picture emerge, or a map emerge, and that's what this is. So we tried to, it's helpful, you know, for the brain to kind of organize things in categories, and that's what we did. So we began to identify 4 different strands of types of learning, and we tried to give you a taste of that today through the 4 different Limmud sessions. Again, this morning we had leadership development and the experiential. This afternoon we had engagement and the enrichment. We did not talk about the 5th column, the cultivation of adult educators, which is really what this whole day is about. But those 4 are the very different kinds of orientations to the 4 kinds of learners. That it doesn't fit neatly. You know, it's not that the spiritual seekers are only looking for X and the goal-oriented are only looking for Y, but that it's a kind of it's a formula. It's kind of a mix. You have to be sensitive to all of these needs at once. So we gave you a taste of 4 very different, from 4 great teachers, from 4 very different kinds of learning experiences. So I wanted to ask you at this point, you know, what's your takeaway from that? What did that teach you about what it is we do and how we can help those who our job is to help be better at what they do?
It just raised a question for me of particularly looking at that exercise this morning for the 5 different rabbis. Do we assume that rabbis, I mean, by and large, most of them have found a way to teach that they're comfortable teaching. And they don't see themselves being a different kind of teacher. And so they found their 16%, and they're there doing their text, and so that goes on. Meanwhile, not much else. So do we assume that these rabbis could learn to teach differently, should learn to teach differently, should learn to give really frontal, smart, brilliant lectures, should learn how to actually talk to mourners who have deep grief and a text might not be the thing that would be most helpful? Or do we say that a synagogue community should try to think who can address the needs of all these learners and who else to bring in? And I was just talking with a friend of mine yesterday who's a rabbi of a congregation, and he said, I've just asked my board, each board member, would you talk to 9 people and find out actually what they would like to learn? And the board members sort of say, well, you know, I'm not that so good at talking to people. So he says, well, otherwise, I'm going to be teaching what I like to teach, and nobody else is going to be. And so how would you then think of making that cultural change where the rabbi both increased their capacity for expanding their teaching abilities and also saw themselves as opening up a broader.
Right. I mean, you're talking about 2 very different things. I mean, the answer to your question is both. You know, that yes, I think that we can help rabbis broaden their repertoire. That we teach within our comfort zone, but you know, that those who are really committed, well, hopefully will see that, gee, it's the same people showing up again and again and again. And why aren't I reaching anybody else? So, you know, if you can spark that, can you change everybody? No, but I think we can change more people than than we have. And, you know, so that's sort of who am I as a teacher? And then the other question is how do I interact with others to create cultural change? That's an organizational change, but it's also a leadership question, and it's also it's an issue of seems to, you know, which we've talked about several times today. But how can I make space in my leadership for other kinds of leadership, for other kinds of expertise? So, an example, and there's lots of examples. I know a couple congregations who are doing some really innovative stuff with Jewish parenting programs, and that they're tapping into the resources of their congregations, and there's lots of Jews, you know, who do social work and counseling and marriage work and, you know, medical people, you know, all of this expertise, who would probably be really honored to be asked and delighted to give back to their community in that way, they might not think about it, but if the rabbi comes and asks them, and would you co-teach with me? What a great experience that would be, and that also shows, you know, so by doing it, you begin to plant the seeds of cultural change. And how do we, you know, I think that one of the things that we also tried to model here today was the unpacking of the learning. And I hope you found that valuable. That as, you know, I thank you, the three teachers who are still here today, you know, I thank you for putting yourself out there in a way that allowed us to, you know, dissect you a little bit. And I do this, I mean, this is what I do back in my day job, you know, a lot, you know, that we unpack our own teaching through videotapes of ourselves teaching. We do a lot of model teaching in classes and unpacking it. We invite guest teachers in and work with them to unpack, and it's a really important way to learn about how do I think about what I'm trying to accomplish, and how does my thinking translate into the doing. So I think that's another way to help rabbis change, is by putting them in this kind of laboratory where there's all kinds of different experiences of teaching and learning taking place, and then there's a lot of analyzing and uncovering of what were your goals, how did you do it, what did you do first, what happened next, why did you do this before that, why did you keep coming back to this, what would you have done if you had more time, you know, all of these different questions that are so important that creates a habit of self-reflection. And I think, you know, a lot of, you know, when you're in the press of your daily life as a congregational rabbi or as a Hillel rabbi or any other kind of rabbi, you know, you're not going to, cultivating that habit is very difficult. So we've got to create the time, the space for them to do it elsewhere. 1, 2, 3.
I think one thing that is often overlooked and that is so simple but is so important, which is, at least in my experience, is that programs sort of draw people, but people draw people. And asking people, what are you interested in learning, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to walk into the classroom to be able to do that learning. And I think that part of it is that fear of feeling infantilized, but I think part of it is I'm going to come in and I'm not going to know anyone else there. So part of it is not just what are you interested in learning in, but identifying those handful of people who are the committed people and inviting them to be part of something there. You know, and it creates a sense of community. I think that's a really critical.
In Jenny's session just now, I mean, she had us imagining ourselves as 30-somethings, and you know, one of the 30-somethings that we brought to the room didn't come because she wanted to come, but she came because her friend brought her, you know. So, and I think that there is definitely, those are the social swimmers, you know, in the pool. You know, they're looking for community, but they're looking for a meaningful community, not just to go out and to have a party or, you know, to go. So they're looking for some meaning.
And how we break that down, the fear, I think, you know, I mean, that's the way, you know, adult Jewish learning, whatever, you know, I think that can be overcome if there's one person who's coming.
I think building on something Lisa said, though, we want we think it's really important that rabbis begin to open up what they think are, what is adult learning, or whatever we call it. That there are lots of things that really people want to learn and outside the old boxes.
Yep.
But I think that the question you raise is about the entry point in and the way in, and who invites them,
Yep.
where it's held, what the conditions are for participation, and how the rabbi creates that
Yep.
atmosphere, which goes back to the rabbi's own reflection on what this is about. And that often, the teacher thinks it's about the teacher, but it's really about the teaching-learning relationship,
Yep.
but that has to include who are your learners and what will make them feel connected. They may not need to. The story I tell with this is, after my father died, I went to say Kaddish, and there were 5 of us, friends, all of whom had lost parents within about a 2-month period. And I thought, if my rabbi had simply called and said, hey, look, I noticed you all there, would you like to come in and just talk about the grieving process, which would have been a learning opportunity, we would have come because he invited us. He would have created a community for us. Instead, we kind of, said things and left. So it's where is the invitation? Who creates the venue for learning? Getting it perhaps outside of the conventional setting, and also making it that it's not a lecture. I didn't need to go lecture. It was a conversation that I was looking for, not to have to go and read 3 books about mourning.
So, maybe Sarah.
I don't think I think it's just reflecting what everybody else has been saying. It's not really about educating on somebody. It's really creating a community of learning, of growth, inspiration, and engagement. And the rabbi's role is not really to be the educator. It's kind of to manage the growth of the community and of the individuals. It's interesting because in the rabbinical school, so there is no community. It's just that you're rabbis, and you're trying to spawn new rabbis. So you want to develop them as educators, and you talk about people in the abstract, and then they get out into the world, and they're dealing with real people, and I do this all the time. That in their first, they have this aha period where they're beginning to realize that it's not about how much. It's not about another 2 parts in the Shulchan Aruch. It's not another daf in the Gemara. People's growth and their engagement. It's not about how much I can teach. It's not how good a teacher I am. It's how I can encourage their own.
Yes, and that's, because we, in rabbinical schools, and I mean to varying degrees, I think all the rabbinical schools really work well in this frame, in the literacy enrichment frame. That's sort of our core curriculum. And so that's what rabbis think is really important, and that's what they know how to teach. And then they go, and it's not that we're taking this off the map. It's still part of the landscape, and there's still people who want to learn that, and there are definitely rabbis who want to teach it, but that if that's all you do, then you are missing your 84% plus everybody else,
Can you really develop expertise in other areas?
No, but you can build the expertise by partnering,
Right.
by being in conversation. And there are, and different rabbis do have different interests, and so maybe, you can build certain areas of expertise, and you'll teach the things that are meaningful to you, but, the things that aren't meaningful to you, that are meaningful to everybody else, you've got to find your partners, so you can build a community. Hang on, I did lots, so Sarah, then Jenny, then Aura.
Just a couple of points, building off what you said, and that's what other people said. A couple of things have come up for me. One of them is that whatever the institution is, whether it's a synagogue-based or something else, JCC, it seems to me that there needs to be some kind of reflective process about making a decision that we're going to move forward on trying to create, build, and support an adult educational setting, whatever name we want to give to it. Not just slapdash, do a little here, do a little there, because from that flows also the alliances, the partnering, even on things like bringing people who are within the community and inviting them. I mean, they could be a great social worker, but a horrible presenter. So how do you communicate what the expectations are if you're going to be a kind of lay teacher, which is a great thing, and I think really important for congregations to think about. And then the other, so that's another thing. Then the issue of the different age cohorts is really important. I mean, I know that in my research, I heard that refrain that people who are, and this was echoed a little bit here as well, but it goes even further. People in their 30s and 40s are interested in things, for example, family-oriented issues and other things that people in their 50s and 60s are not so no longer, the empty nesters are not so longer interested in, and then people upper history, philosophy. I mean, obviously you have crossovers, but that's something that the rabbis, even in my study, they seem to be completely oblivious to. They don't realize that it's not all just bar mitzvah and up, or whatever.
Yeah, that question about what's an adult, I mean, and what's an adult changes throughout the lifespan, and you have different developmental tasks at different stages of adulthood and different developmental needs, which is what Sarah's referring to, in that, you know, the greater awareness we have of what those are, and a 45-year-old who's a new parent has a lot in common with a 28-year-old who's a new parent around parenting, but are going to be at very different places in their lives around different issues, so you have to be aware of that too. So that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think actually Diane said it very specifically, which is that to really, when we begin to approach this arena of what we're trying to craft in whatever space that it's trying to be created, we actually go back very simply to the 5 W's and sort of say, who are we really trying to meet? Why are we trying to meet this need in this community? Is that true? And you know, you sort of really work your way through that. The only other thing that I would say that I don't think has been said here is on the chart this morning, I think Ariel, the young rabbi, was sort of matched with the young learners, like the new moms, and I would say that that's a mistake. That I think a lot of rabbis at lots of different age levels have lots to give to emerging adults or older adults at lots of different age levels, and that can be you can have a very rewarding experience as a young rabbi in a room full of people who are all over 70, you know, and I think that to automatically assume that the young rabbi is going to be most comfortable working with the families in the ECC, and the senior rabbi, if we're talking in a pulpit setting, is going to be more comfortable working with the older adults in the congregation. That's a mistake, and it sort of bifurcates the congregation in a really unhealthy way. And I think that to me, on that chart was almost like, that's not true. But it is true. It's true in a lot of places. Right. And it's not just because sometimes it comes from the rabbi. Right. And sometimes it comes from the congregation. Right. And so I think that the more that we can do to just make sure that everybody that rabbis have a broad range of materials from which to draw, but also experiences with lots of different learners. It's very helpful. Laura.
Yeah, and just to keep going with that, I think that we were talking just a minute ago about what can you do in rabbinical school or cantorial school to get there, and I would say that you absolutely can open up a wide variety of types of learning and types of learning styles, whether you can do them all or not. And so just knowing that they're out there and that your colleagues and friends have enjoyed studying that way just opens it as a possibility, and you may be more likely to ask someone to teach that. Right. I also think that we as teachers in rabbinical schools can model stretching out of our comfort zone. I just taught a course last year in the book of Samuel through the arts, and my students all know that I'm afraid of art. So it was fun, but it was a challenge, and you know, so even that process, I think, is an important process. And yet at the same time, to build that with that issue of authenticity that you were really stressing this morning, and so to keep straight that just because you know about all these different things doesn't mean you do them all well, and that need for authenticity. So I think keeping those tensions in there, I think, is a very important part of the learning.
I'm wondering about something, whether we have different assumptions amongst ourselves and also amongst the rabbis that we're talking about, around two concepts that we've been using a lot, 2 words we've been throwing around a lot, as to the means of which is the means and which is the end. So are we doing engagement to get to learning? Are we doing learning to get to engagement? Or are learning and engagement the same thing? And I'm wondering if we're having different assumptions, and if those different assumptions lead to have implications that differ.
Yeah, it's like a Venn, there's a Venn diagram.
Right.
You know, there's overlap there, and
I
that,
think we're creating entry points.
yeah.
Whatever creates the, and it may not, I didn't know I was coming for learning. I thought I was coming to meet other mothers. But oh, and then I learned something that's take away, that makes it safer to learn the next time.
There's, you know, triggers,
But
things
in your
that,
end, you just gave it as the end is learning.
This is a session about, you know, how to create adult learning opportunities. But, and yes, I think, going back to Lisa's swimmers, people, my mother-in-law went to every adult education thing in her community. It didn't matter what it was. She didn't know what she learned, but she was there for everything. It was a tremendously important social experience for her, and it enhanced her Jewish identity as well. This was in her Jewish community. Actually, she went to the local college as well, because that was her way of being, that's her sense of herself as an adult in a community.
I think engagement can and should lead to learning. Learning should and can lead to engagement, that it happens both ways, and that it should happen both ways, and that because we don't know where people are, you know, people are going to come in at different points in their lives. There are going to be different triggers, different motivations, sometimes because of friends bringing them in, sometimes because there's a real need that they have a burning question, sometimes because they're looking for something. They're looking for community, they're looking for guidance, they've got intellectual thirst, spiritual thirst, you know, all kinds of different things are happening that we got to try to touch and respond. And then, I think that human beings are meaning-seeking enterprises. You know, that's what it's all about. To be human is to find meaning. Some of us do it more actively than others. You know, for some it's kind of it's suppressed. You know, when you're and you know, so for them, I mean, our job is to ignite it. You know, we've talked a lot about the tensions in the roles of the rabbis, and I think one of the great tensions for the rabbi is when do you hold and hug, and when do you push, and when do you challenge, and I mean that can happen so powerfully in a learning experience. You know, the pushing and the challenging. But in a way that's safe and embracing too. So that's one of the great tensions that I think we have to negotiate as educators. But you know, ultimately, life is about growth. So it's all education. Yeah, right.
If I can, I wanted just to shift to another topic that Jenny, you alluded to in your session before, but we didn't really get to, and I would be help. Notwithstanding Jeff's comment about, you know, it's about asking people, talking to people in terms of how you get people to things. But we talked about the ineffectiveness of the adult ed brochure.
Yeah.
I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the role of branding, of you know, labeling, marketing, the choice of location. Because I don't, we haven't had like an explicit conversation about that, but it's not the answer to getting people to show up, but it's a piece of the equation that I think is important.
Yeah, I think, setting, timing, mode of delivery. I mean, we talked also a lot about the use of media, the use of social networking. You know, when is that an enhancement? When is it a barrier? Naming, you know, how we title our whatever we're calling them, programs, events, courses, you know, in a way that, and being transparent also, so that when you come up with your description, it's got to be really clear what it is you're doing, so that you have the best chance of attracting the kind of learner that you're imagining is going to be the right person for this experience. So all of those are really important. I mean, you're asking me, do I have an answer for what should we call it if we're not going to call it adult Jewish learning? I don't yet, but it's something I'm going to go home and think about.
No, I guess I was more asking just, I mean, even that unless you don't want to take a conversation that way, just to hear about some of the different kinds of things people have done. And there, I mean, I don't know, Jenny, if you want to address this directly, there's sort of an awareness you brought about, you know, in a particular kind of case where you were looking at a particular kind of non-traditional learning group, just examples of the thinking outside of the box that got different results.
Well, for example, Jeremy Morrison in the Riverway Project in Boston for young adults has Torah and tonics. So it's a gather Torah and tonics.
Okay, not tonics.
No, not tonight. Tonics, and it's gathering at a bar to study. Now that is targeted at a particular market, and it's I mean there are definitely programs around the country that are branding themselves they're very market driven, and this is out of the comfort zone of a lot of us to have to sell our product. And so there's the transparency, but there's also how do I package and what's the packaging look like? I did an interview once with a rabbi of a large congregation in Los Angeles who had a budget for marketing her adult learning that so surpasses the budget for all of adult learning in most congregations. But it was glossy. It had to compete with the UCLA Continuing Ed a brochure, which is like a phone book of offerings. She had to get it out before in front of people 3 times, the announcements of things. There's all kinds of marketing strategies. And I think Milton did that as well. Lots of ways to how we package, how we advertise, and many local rabbis don't have the budget or that sensibility. Now, they may have people in the congregation who are resources for that. I know Elise Goldstein at Coel in Toronto, she traded. You can take courses if you'll do my marketing for me. And, you know, those are negotiations we make.
I think doing Jewish in the public square is going to become more and more common, and that's where the creativity is going to emerge. There is some creativity emerging from the synagogue, but I think more of it's coming out from outside the synagogue, and we've got, you know, if you're in the synagogue, you've got to learn, you've got to be in conversation and understand how that's happening and why that's happening. Again, a lot of it goes back to some of the things Sid was saying. So yeah, I mean, then we got business people in our congregations. I mean, we have those resources and expertise. It's not like we have to do it all. So
I just wanted to piggyback off what you said. I think that one of the things that really does need to be looked at more carefully is that the rabbis need to understand and think about what are they meaning. Do they mean engagement as a form of getting in? What are they trying to achieve through learning?
That was what I was trying to say.
That's
yeah.
the point, that a lot of the rabbis are very, it seems to me in my research experience, the better rabbis are really clear, and from that clarity, they are able to then move forward to crafting what it is that they and their institution are trying to do. It's not hit or miss, it's intentional, which is what we would like education to be. So, but it's often not. So I think that to learn, you know, that's the rabbi's job, so to speak. But they don't really get much preparation to do that. They're not given much guidance with heading into situations. So know to do that. That's my experience.
We should be doing that for any program. Is why am I doing this program? What am I trying to get out of it? Whether it's a learning program or a service or whatever else.
yeah,
Well, this is sort of an answer to you, but also one of the things I'm walking away with is I teach at Skirball. I teach the Writers Bake Midrash there, and in Sid's talk, and well, I actually, I mean, with all humility, I actually think this is the future, because creating gateways whereby people can enter, I think that's what you said, and it is very successful because people come in, they don't want to own Judaism necessarily, but I'm a writer, I'm going to show up because I want to write, and maybe I think I want to do it in a Jewish setting. Same thing with the artist. I'm going away thinking I'm going to go tell Skirball that we should do a cooking bake midrash. You know, I mean, food is such a big, so again, get people where they are, and then, okay, so you know, while the brownies are baking, you slip a text in and you look at it for a few minutes, but just the idea is that...
well, not just that, you know, the sort of Jewish ethnic cooking, or, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can connect cooking to something more substantive.
than the nourishment that it provides.
People have had success sticking things into brownies for years.
Yeah. Check. Do that today. I think one of the things that we didn't talk about today, and it's sort of like the doorknob conversation, is Hebrew. In some of this, and I.
Oh, there's lots we didn't talk about.
Right, well, so one of the things that I think is worth percolating on your way home, however you're getting home today, is Hebrew, because I think even in something as simple as advertising, when you say a writer's Beit Midrash, or when you have a program called Maya, and I don't know that Maya means 100 until I know that I'm putting in 100 hours, that means something different to somebody who does. And if the branding is in Hebrew, or the branding has even transliterated Hebrew in it, it's not, you're not clearly thinking through your who am I trying to reach. And not every program is always going to be about learning. There are synagogues that are doing Zumba, and yoga, and whatever they're doing to get people in the space, and maybe they're sneaking in something, or they're not sneaking in anything, but there's lots of different ideas about what do we call this in order to get who we want to get in the door, right? And so there's that aspect of it also, and I would say that Hebrew plays a big role in that.
My observation from a lot of this conversation is that rabbis need conversations to reflect on their work as adult educators, about how they're teaching, what they're teaching, who they're teaching, why they're teaching, their assumptions about teaching, their fears about teaching, that unless we create those conversations, which is I think what ACRE can do, would like to do, that just as the Institute for Jewish Spirituality created conversations about clergy spirituality, for some reason this got lost in as I've looked at the field of adult Jewish learning over the last 15, 18 years, this piece hasn't really been addressed very systematically. As Lisa said, people teach the way they were taught. They often don't understand what a good educational program, curriculum or design looks like, so they plan it on the way driving to the setting, to the shul or wherever.
Or even more tragically, they have a brilliant idea and then they don't deliver it, and then
they deliver it and it's at the wrong level for their learners or whatever. So how to create reflective practice about our work as educators of adults, which then, as I said earlier today, puts the rabbi in the role of learner. And what we know it from Hartman, the rabbis love to go and learn. Can they translate their own learning experience into becoming effective teachers? And why does it work for them at Hartman or in your programs? But what happens when they get home? And I talk about it's important when we come down from the mountain. Who do we talk to when we get home? So who are the conversation partners that ACRE can create for rabbis for this kind of developing of their own practice? My comment about adult development and learning is, as Lisa said, we are meaning-making individuals, and most of us can't give ourselves a massage. We need someone to help us with that reflective process, with that reframing and rethinking. What is it that would make us better? And that's our own growth, but it also involves new learning. So to me, they're quite inextricably connected. But I really urge ACRE as an organization to think about how to create, and the constituent organizations, how do you create conversations, safe conversations for rabbis as learners about their practice to become more effective teachers.
I think then that really turns it over to you for some wrap up.
Oh, we're wrapping up? Okay.
Well,
How
yeah,
about actually in that dimension, Steve, I would like him to talk about the proposal that ACRE submitted to Covenant, because he's much more familiar than I am with it. Steve?
Yeah.
I would think it would be a great time now for you to tell us about the proposal to Covenant, what the idea is. And not that we know that we'll get the grant, but God willing we do, and then what will we be able to have happen?
Okay. So, have you been in contact or just want to?
Well, we're doing a
Why don't you
wrap
go
up,
to the
so
front?
instead of.
Yeah, I think we've reached a good point to
Cool, okay. Wow.
move on.
Okay, good.
But the part that people were saying, that Diane was saying as you were out, was that there are no opportunities for conversation about teaching adults to take place, and that this is a function that Acre could develop, and therefore.
So, as a result of conversations amongst Acres Executive Committee last year, we came to the idea of putting together a proposal to the Covenant Foundation to get a proposal about creating a 2-year, fairly intensive program for Acre participating organizations. So it would be open one person from every organization to spend 2 years looking at the theory of adult learning, the theory of what's going on in the world of adult Jewish education, a gathering of data about all the programs in one place, which you were talking about. So we would do a research piece, and we would do a combination of theory and very much practical training. I don't know if training is the right word, but working with each of the providers, representatives, to help them better understand their practice and what they are doing with their particular groups, and develop, as it were, over the course of 2 years or whatever it is, a working curriculum which could actually be adopted and used with each of the organizations, so that it not only would help those people who work with rabbis, but ultimately could then get translated into actually working with rabbis. So we put together that proposal. We got through the first phase, so we are finalists with many other things. I think there's like 32 finalists or something like that this year, an awful lot. We could probably fund 6 or 7. And we will know in December whether or not we've received the grant. So obviously some of us who were involved in the planning of this conference had in the back of our minds this as some way being an introduction, a test case, just to see sort of what the feeling was amongst the group. Is this something of particular interest? Does this resonate? Could this be what we envision it could be, something which could be of value across the world of continuing rabbinic education? And obviously, many of the questions which were raised here and all ultimately put in the parking lot for today would come back in some serious way and help people really not only think about, but look at their own particular practice. I even used the phrase, excuse it, people would put together their own IEPs. People would actually think about what it is that they would like to improve in their own particular practice, and use some language about, education language about really having a mentor who's going to work with each of the people to help them on their practice. So it would be a very personalized working with representatives across, with the ultimate goal that it could be turned around and worked into the field. And if we get the sense, by the way, that this is something that's of importance to Acre qua Acre, and if we don't get the covenant grant, it doesn't mean that that would preclude us from trying to find other sources of funding to do something like that if there's really if there's serious interest about that going forward.
Oh, do you think there is serious interest in this? Do you think this is an important topic that your organizations would actually want to, get more involved in, or to pick up more? Would this be something that each one would only want to do on their own, or that there could be a sense of a kind of collective uplifting of practice? I'm asking all of you here yet what you...
I mean, I'm going to be honest, I still feel that in the Jewish educational world, their leadership is trying to move away from a kind of school-based model to a more lifelong learning, congregational learning model. But I think that there really doesn't seem to me to be a priority that rabbis and other educators really need to understand that it's not just about K through 8 or K through 12, that really hasn't gone deep. There's something about the panic about, like you were talking about, the survivalist mode. You got to get the kids, you got to get the kids, you got to send them to Israel, you got to do this, and there's this whole adult. You know, most people who are in the country are adults. So, but I don't think the message, like I even see at JTS, there's not one course offered to teach adults. It's not on the radar screen.
I teach one.
Teach one.
We need to talk to your dean about that one.
So, just, I mean, reflecting, really, it's not, that, for whatever reason, you had a bunch of names on the participant list, and your numbers here have not been big. So I don't know whether that is because of clashes with other things, or whether that is in some way a reflection of what you have just said. I'm just...
I can respond to that, the answer is there's no correspondence between people not being here and their lack of interest in that particular topic. Certainly, for all the people, I've spoken to pretty much every person who's not here, and the reasons are not because of the topic.
Okay. So I didn't want to make an assumption, but reflecting off that, I was wondering whether, envisioning a program of that kind, whether you're, notwithstanding the mission of ACRE, so maybe just this isn't mission compliant, but whether the most effective way to get that outcome out there is in fact, as opposed to train the trainers and wait till they've managed to work through the bureaucracy of their various seminaries or places in order to get courses and various things in place, whether it might not work as like the CLAL model, where you actually recruit practitioners from a variety of places and start to build a body of people who take that message out and who are modeling it. And so, and sort of from the ground up, you start to create a body of people who can actually just put it out there into the world. That's a question.
That would go back to a mission discussion.
Right.
I think this is just going to add one more layer of the question of what do we mean when we say adult Jewish learning, and how are we teaching people how to address that. I'm curious if there's room also to begin so just for clarity, I study sermons and religious orators using political discourse in their sermons, okay, which has meant that I have looked at sermons as adult education models, and if that is an effective, in 2011, means of adult education, if it's taught, if the sermon is taught from a perspective of adult development and what's really happening in that 10 to 45 minute period that rabbis are speaking from the pulpit, it is true, 45 minutes, usually on the high holiday. But,
Once or twice.
but I think that there are other spaces in rabbinic education to begin to introduce theories of adult development and adult education. So even if you're not thinking, oh, a sermon is a model of adult education, when you come into rabbinical school, homiletics is an opportunity to say, let's talk about adult development for a minute, and what are you trying to do in a sermon? CPE, right, pastoral education, is an opportunity to say, what are the stages that adults are going through at this certain developmental stages in their lives, and how are you responding to that? It doesn't always have to come back to the text, the page, the Torah yoga, Lisa and I talk about Torah yoga, all of those things. There's other ways to, in rabbinic education, to begin in getting adults brought into the picture.
It just is important, though, that the seminaries treat the students as adult learners.
Absolutely.
And not as pediatric learners. And that is one of the biggest complaints that I hear from rabbinical students, that they're not, good adult education practice isn't in place, so they're being one more time to sit at the feet of the master and not be empowered themselves. So it's layered in terms of how can they don't learn that, and they go out and teach that way as well.
Again, I mean, I agree with that completely, but there's also then the developmental path or the arc of the rabbi, and when they're in rabbinical school, I think about this a lot. I mean, we have a required education course in their second year when they come back from Israel at HEC. And most of them, the vast majority of them are teaching in religious schools at that time. And so the education course is really geared to teaching kids, which is their immediate need. What I'd really like to do with that course is get them to think about big ideas in education. You know, what is it that we should be educating for, and what is Jewish education, and you know, but they are so not ready for that conversation because they have to figure out how to deal with a class of unruly fifth graders. So, and that's, I mean, I think this idea too of so much of this needs to happen in the workplace, or certainly in their later years of rabbinical school, because they're just not ready. When earlier on, and we have to be mindful of that as well.
Generally, just so you know, as an organization, and implicit in the title of Continuing Rabbinic Education is we don't really focus a lot on what happens in the rabbinical seminaries, but you know, all the rabbinical seminaries are part of this consortium. And I spoke with the leadership of all of the seminaries before putting together this covenant grant proposal, just to get their perspective on that. And of course, they thought it was a great idea, and you know, they were very supportive of it. And each one of them, in their own way, said, "And we should be doing more of it here too." So, you know, one of the things that we can perhaps be as an organization is a catalyst for innovating and changing the way that not only things happen in CRE, but obviously in the pre-CRE mold. And the more people get together and talk about these ideas and think about possible connections and intersections, you know, the more we can perhaps bring about some of these things.
It is pretty interesting when you think of how much hope is now being put on reaching out, outreach, new this, new that, new that. Nothing about how actually effective is the teaching that's going to go on. You have a Moshe house and, you know, there's somebody there. Could they be a better teacher? Would more people come in? Like, it's just such, it's like, hello, Boker Tov, you know, let's pay attention here. That's weird. So if we even serve to do that, of kind of keep raising this issue, and first thing, does anyone else have anything more to say on this topic? Yeah.
I think we have to be careful about the language. I think it might actually help to lose this word education, and maybe talk about, and even maybe lose development and talk about facilitating Jewish growth and exploration. Because that's actually what we're trying to get people to do, and if they understood those techniques, they could use them in education, in other places
We'll
to
become
reach
the
one
school
group.
of facilitating Jewish growth and exploration.
SCG,
I like it.
Yeah.
I would say that of all the books on adult learning that have been influential, the one on the list, Developing Adult Learners, which is the developmental model, which shows how different institutions, what they do to develop the learner, I think is really a wonderful resource. So that's on the list, Developing Adult Learners, and it's again, how we grow, help people to grow and cope with change.
It'd probably be good, I mean, maybe you've already done this, but to ask people how they see themselves. You know, like, what are you? Are you an underdeveloped and an undergrown person? That really help you grow? Or, you know, that might not be the thing, you know?
Yeah.
So there's so much of the, we're the inside, you're the outside, let us enlighten you, that
You have to just
You know, we
break
need
up
to-
But you're
those
taking it from the negative. Are you under? Do you want to grow and explore, or do you want to be educated?
or something, I mean, we don't,
Are you on the journey?
yeah.
Well, that's, yeah.
A lot of journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is good.
It's whatever, I mean, if you look at all the self-help books, they say what it is that people think they are, and it mostly has to do with journeying and wanting to be happy and better in life. Sid.
Yeah, but I think that Linda said something very important, because I've been wrestling with this all day long. I do think that the larger acre mission may not be well served by the term adult Jewish learning. I think one is a subset of the other. And I think that given where the community is at right now, the language of adult Jewish learning is too small to accomplish what acre needs to be. I think that's part of what Linda said.
Yeah, we said that
I think
earlier.
that's our-
Yeah, I don't think you were here, but we all kind of agreed on that.
Okay, anything else that someone would, I think this is really really interesting. So Diane and Lisa and Rachel, no, Sarah and Rachel and Jenny, thank you so much for your time. Jerry, thank you for your time. Conception.
And
Rachel,
Sid.
thank you for your time.
And
And Sid, thank you for traveling up here and really setting very thoughtful framework. And I think that framework is something to just, it's the stretch beyond which, I mean, we should not be thinking of ourselves as being something that's less than that whole picture that you